Hi, I'm Jeff Davis of the Sonoma County Wine Library Association with today's Visual Oral History. My guest is the owner, president, and chairman of Korbel Champagne Cellars, Mr. Gary Heck. Gary, thank you so much for inviting us to
Thank you, Jeff.
this
Nice
beautiful,
being
cozy
here.
spot you have here on the property.
Thank you. Very nice being here.
You have had such a history here, and following in your father's footsteps, you've done so much over the last, gosh, how many decades now? 7?
Yeah, well, Dad purchased Korbel in 1954, so it's been since 54.
And you spent nearly your entire life here on the
Just
property.
about. Dad bought the company in 54. We actually moved on property in 1955, and I was born in 47, so I was only like 7 years old when we moved here. So, yeah, I've been here basically my whole life.
And obviously, you've seen a lot of changes over
A lot
those
of changes.
decades.
A lot of changes.
What was it like growing up here as a kid?
I couldn't ask for a better childhood. I grew up on horseback. I grew up in a very small town. Guerneville in those days was like 2,500 people. A one-room school, just over the hill, about a half a mile from here for the first 5 grades, 5
Wow.
years, and so it was. But it was just a wonderful place to grow up. Grew up with my family and a lot of friends that came up from the Bay Areas would come up in the summertime. So we had just a great time here growing up, and mostly time on horseback and up in the hills and camping and hunting and fishing and just doing what kind of like back in the 1800s, really.
I was going to say that taking the horse to school and the one-room schoolhouse just sounds like something right out
I
of the
grew up a
1800s.
cowboy. I really did. Yeah. Yes, I did.
And you probably wore a hat too, didn't you?
Oh, we did. Yes, we did. We all wore cowboy hats.
You told me a funny story about how one time when you would go camping up in the hills, up in the
Yes.
woods there, your mother would watch you and you would have a signal for her.
Oh, we did. Yeah, yes, we did. Yeah, if we went camping, which we were allowed to do, and we did that starting at about 7, 8 years old. And, we had to have help saddling our horses because the horse was a little taller than we could reach.
Sure.
So, but once we got them saddled, we were okay. And then if we did go camping, we spent the night up in the mountains behind me here, and we had to let my mom know every night that the minute it started getting dark, in whatever time of year it was, once it got dark enough that she could see a lantern, we'd ride our horses across the top of the mountain and let her know that we were still alive and up there and safe. And then she'd get the flashlight and blink it at us, say that she received our message and we were okay. So
And that's quite a distance too, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
look up there at the top of the mountain there.
Yeah.
And it's a ways up there.
quite a ways up there.
I remember when we talked before, you remembered your school teacher's name,
Mrs. Johnson.
Mrs. Johnson.
Yes,
And
yes.
how many kids were in that school?
Oh, there wasn't that many. It was 8 grades, 1 teacher, and there was probably 10 kids in the whole school. Yeah, but it didn't last very long because I think when Mrs. Johnson wanted to retire, there was nobody that wanted to try to take that on. It was a little one-room schoolhouse, and it's still the house is gone, the school is gone, but it is the forestry ranger station there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It wasn't lost on me years later when you took over from your father in 1982 that was exactly 100 years after the Korbel Brothers established the winery.
That's right. Yeah, 1982, I became president. I took over most of my dad's duties in 1974, but a few years earlier than 82. But he wanted me to take the presidency in 82, so I accepted it. I turned it down a few years because I didn't want to step my dad's toes. It was his winery, his place, and I was just honored to be able to work for him.
Watching that video on your website, I was impressed with all that the history of that the Korbel brothers had here on the property, especially Francis, who more or less started his life after escaping from prison in Prague.
Yeah, I believe that was like 1848. He was arrested in a student uprising in Prague, which is now Czechoslovakia, and there was a firearm discharge. Now, whether he fired it or somebody else did, but he did get arrested, and they put him in prison in Prague for 2. He stayed. It was 17-year sentence, I believe, and he stayed for 2 years, and then he escaped very, very,
Cleverly?
yes, very cleverly. His mother brought in a set of clothes, street clothes for him, because I guess in those days they wore the stripes.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah,
Something
probably
like
whatever
that.
they wore in prison in those days. I'm not sure, but it obviously identified as a prisoner. So his mother brought in some clothes, regular street clothes. He changed in the street clothes, and just when she left, they walked out the door behind her. But then he left. He left Prague right after that,
I
and then
imagine.
went to Holland to learn cigar making, and learned how to make cigars in Holland. And then he headed off about 2 years later. He headed off for United States.
New York, is that where he landed?
New York,
And
yes.
were his brothers with him at that time?
No, his brothers came over later, but he came over and with his cigar making and worked in New York, and did other things too in New York. I think he was a waiter for a while, and he did a whole bunch of stuff in New York. But
Yeah. And what brought him out here, I think you told me it was the gold rush.
that's what, yeah. One of his brothers joined him in New York for a couple of years, and then they decided they wanted to come out to the 49 gold rush, and so, like everybody else, I guess,
Right.
did back in those days. And
Much of America.
he didn't quite make it in time. Now, so the story goes that they were sailing out here, and it took them 3 years to get out here. That story's a little hard for me to
Even if
to
you have to go
believe, but-
down around South America,
yeah,
it shouldn't
I'm
take.
sure they had to go around the Horn and everything, but
Didn't
but
take 3
still,
years to
3
do that.
years seems like an awful lot of long time. They could have walked easier than that, but then once they got here, the gold rush was over with.
But they were so entrepreneurial. He created the first thing they did, I guess, was make cigar boxes.
Yeah,
Is that it?
yes, they somehow put a deal together with the government to buy most of the land, basically everything from about where 101 is now, all the way up to almost the Oregon border, and
Wow.
they cut trees, just everything they cut, and this property here was basically their lumber mill. And where the parking lot now is where their lumber mill was, and they had the lumber mill, and they actually made their own lumber for all the beams in the winery, and all the beams that were over in the some of the wineries in Napa and stuff, were the old big old redwood beams over there, all from
Oh,
the
good.
mill here in Korbel. And they mostly made this very thin wall planks for cigar boxes up until the mill burned down. And that kind of put them out of business. But they also, by the time they lost the mill, they pretty much had depleted most of the lumber around this area.
That's hard to imagine when
yeah.
you look
Can you
around.
imagine doing that today?
Yeah.
Cutting
Oh,
trees,
right.
cutting those magnificent, beautiful trees down. I mean, some of those trees are bigger than this room, and they would cut them down and they'd make them into lumber for their
It's
cigar
hard to
box.
imagine you can cut down a huge redwood to make a cigar box.
Oh, yeah,
That's
and,
so
and-
small.
and they didn't have electric chainsaws in those days. So
No, yeah.
everything had to be done manually. Cutting those trees down was quite. It took them 3 or 4 days to cut a tree down, and they cut them all down, because most of the trees that you see around Sonoma County are all second growth.
Ah.
There's very little. There's some first growth in Armstrong Woods,
Mm-hmm.
which is just only 10 miles down the road from here, and Colonel Armstrong's still there. That tree is like it's huge, but if they cut those kind of trees down,
Yeah. That's a good indication how big they would have been if they had been
huge.
allowed to continue to
Yeah.
grow
Yeah.
over the
but
century.
once they cut all the trees down, they tried tobacco. Why? I don't know, but we have pictures of tobacco fields here.
Not too warm here for that.
It's not quite the right temperature for tobacco here, but they tried tobacco, they tried prunes, apples. Apples probably should have done pretty well here. They always did very well in Sebastopol, apple capital of the world, or for a while, or Gravestein, capital of the world. But they tried pears, they tried prunes, apples, tobacco. They even tried cotton, which didn't well. Then finally, after most of the stuff that didn't work, they went to the University of California and in Davis, and they said, well, you ought to try some grapes. Try some grapes here. So that's how they got in the grape business.
How's that worked out?
It's worked out all right. Yeah, we've done all right.
And along the way too, they you told me once they made all the bricks for this property right
Yes,
here.
they did. Yes, all the bricks that the winery's made out of, and the tower's made of, and most of the buildings around here are made of, were all made here. When the mill burnt down, and they still that spot in front of the winery there, that's where they made a brickyard. They poured all their own bricks and made all their own bricks here.
Yeah, boy, they were inventive and
Yes,
had
they were.
quite a bit of energy, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And the Brandy Tower, which is made of brick,
Yeah.
is kind of a throwback to when he was in jail. He was in a tower in Prague.
Yes, he
wasn't
was. It's supposedly the replica of the tower.
A smaller version.
Obviously, the tower must be a lot bigger than our Brandy Tower, the prison that he was in. But it's supposed to be a replica of the shape of the prison that he was in.
You wouldn't think he'd want to have memories of that, but maybe
I
it's
don't
his
think I
way
would.
of saying, I escaped that. It's in my past, but I
I
pay
guess
homage to
that'd
getting
be kind
away.
of the thing I'd want to forget, not to remember. But
You'd think, yeah.
They did their own thing in those back then.
They also built the railroad. They had a schooner.
Yeah, they had a couple schooners that one sailed out of San Francisco, and one sailed out of Fort Ross, somewhere up near Fort Ross, that sailed, and I believe they went around the Horn, and they took logs to New York, they took logs to San Francisco. They had their headquarters when they actually got into the wine side of it. We'll get back to that in a minute, but they did actually have the cigar box manufacturing in San Francisco also for a while. But when the trees kind of ran out and it was a little bit more difficult to move, even when they had their own railroad and stuff, it was still tough to move the logs down to San Francisco to get them milled and then make cigar box out of them. But they also had a printing company. And they had a newspaper called The Wasp, which was a political sting. That's how they got it.
Yeah.
Whichever party, I guess, was in power, they were stinging them on the other side.
Stinging commentary.
Yeah, the newspaper was called The Wasp, so
That's great.
It was interesting.
Um,
They the Korbels kind of just about did everything.
It sounds like it. Yeah. You were going to go back to something. What was that?
Well, when they had their office in San Francisco before they started their winemaking, but then when they did start their winemaking process, they used the San Francisco office as their first distribution. That's where they actually started distributing stuff to the West Coast out of their San Francisco office.
Tell me about the railroad a little bit more, because that river road that is there now used to be the railway.
Yeah,
but it stopped at about, where was it? Rio Nido or?
That's the other way. It stopped Rio Nido coming south. Coming west, it stopped right there where the steel bridge is there, Hacienda. That was the end of the road. There was no bridge. Now, they actually eventually did build a wooden bridge there for the railroad to cross. That is now where the steel bridge is for the cars to cross. But the only way to get to Korbel was by rail.
And then they brought the train right to this location.
Right here.
That's as far as it went.
We still have the original rail station down in front of the winery.
Right. And you had a post office here.
Yes, we had a post office. Korbel, where we're sitting right now, actually was a town at one time. There was a post office here, and it was called Korbel. There is a Korbel town still in California, Humboldt area. There is still a town of Korbel up there.
Is that related to that family, or?
No, they owned it.
Okay.
Korbel's owned it
They
at
had
one
that as
time,
well.
but they gave it up or whatever. But
Yeah.
they didn't keep on to it.
Yeah. But yeah, what a history they had here on this property. But interestingly, as we got into the 1900s and later, their family members didn't have interest in continuing with the winery, did they?
They had no sons. They had some some daughters. They had some in-laws that were not really that interested in the winemaking business. You know, the whole winemaking part of the Korbel story, although they were successful in their own right because it was a nice bottle of sparkling champagne that and they had some good notoriety on it, but they never sold a whole hell of a lot of cases. Very small. And what they did What they did sell was mostly local and into a lot of local restaurants and that kind of stuff. They finally did get some distribution on the East Coast. It was very, when Dad bought it, it was very, very small. It was strictly on a little bit in New York, a little bit in Chicago, and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that's about it. There was not much distribution in the rest of the United States. It was very, very small. But they really, the family really didn't, their heart and soul was in the lumber business.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they made their fortune.
Uh-huh.
They were never going to make their fortune in the champagne or wine business. And it's the interesting story of the Korbels on the wine side of it is that they really didn't start out as a winery. They started out as a champagne company.
Right.
When they got the grapes, they didn't know what to do with them. Francis and his brother Joseph went back to Czechoslovakia and found a winemaker by the name of
Right.
Frank Hassig.
Uh-huh.
And Frank Hassig was a champagne maker more
Okay.
so than a winemaker. And he said he would come to California and he would work for the Korbels, but he was going to make champagne. He wasn't going to make wine. He'd make the wine into champagne, but he was not interested in just making still wine. It was going to put bubbles in the bottles or he wasn't going to make it. So that's how they got into the champagne business. Is they brought the man Frank Hassig out here, who was their first and only winemaker up until Dad bought it, and they just made champagne. They did not make wine for sale.
By 1894, the Korbel brothers began to sell their champagne. In 1915, F. Korbel and Brothers won the grand prize during the Panama Pacific International Exposition World's Fair held in San Francisco. Their future was bright, full of life, and was poised to continue to grow. Meanwhile, a movement of temperance had been sweeping across the U.S., which eventually led to the passing of the 18th Amendment, which stalled Korbel's promising future. During Prohibition, the brothers reduced their inventory, and Korbel was permitted to make and sell a limited amount of wine and brandy for altar and medicinal purposes. Yet none of the founding Korbel brothers would live to see the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. Ownership of the winery passed to a second generation, 7 cousins in all. Then in the early 1950s, the cousins decided to sell the business. At the same time, a third-generation winemaker by the name of Adolf L. Heck had great interest in buying F. Korbel and Brothers Incorporated.
My great-grandfather, Ludwig Heck, had a winery in Alsace-Lorraine in Germany, and then his father, who was Adolf, as a German immigrant, moved to the United States and owned part of and worked at Cook's Champagne Company in St. Louis, Missouri. And my dad worked there growing up, and then he went to Germany to go to Geisenheim University to learn winemaking.
Okay.
Technically, and,
Right.
and more on the lab side than on the practical making, because my grandfather could have taught him that. But then my grandfather lost the winery during the war. And my dad went to work for National Distillers up in Ohio and ran 11 wineries up in Ohio. And that's where I was born. That's why I was born in Ohio. He was
Okay.
running wineries up in Ohio before he bought Korbel.
And that's interesting that they were involved with Cook's, because if I'm not mistaken, Cook's also calls themselves Champagne.
Yes,
too,
they do.
don't Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the few.
Well, back in the 40s, 30s, and 40s, it was called Cook's Imperial Champagne, and it was the I don't know if you remember that label, but it's still the Cook's label that's out there now, but it was Method Champenoise even in St. Louis, and it had the sailing ship, the schooner on the label, and that was the Cook's Imperial Champagne. That was my grandfather's winery, and then when Dad came out to California, when he worked in Ohio, National Distillers bought Italian Swiss Colony.
Oh.
And Italian Swiss Colony in 1950, when they bought it, was the largest winery in the United States.
Right.
It was bigger than Gallo. And they came out and they sent my dad out here to run Italian Swiss Colony. He did that for 3 years and then bought Korbel.
Wow. So many people and family members today that are still in the wine business came through Italian Swiss colony, didn't they?
Oh yeah,
I mean, that was I guess the major employer of the time
it was.
in that
Yes,
business.
it was.
Yeah.
It was a huge company.
I can just barely remember wines from Italian Swiss colony as a
Little
kid.
winemaker me commercials stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Huh. And your father was quite an innovator in the business while he was here, and specifically the method champenois style.
Yes,
And
yes.
then you came along and you kept adding more and more varieties, didn't you?
Yeah, I added quite a few more varieties. That Dad, when we bought Korbel, the only champagne they made was sec.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't make a Brut. So Dad introduced a Brut in probably around the 1963, 64 era. He introduced Brut. And then he had his own special champagne that only he had for himself. That it was a champagne that he called Natural, which is one of the labels we have now, Natural. That he released in 1962, but it was only for the wine shop and for his own personal use. It was actually Brut, with no dosage added to it. So it was no sugar added.
Okay.
So it was very dry.
Hence the natural.
And that's how it became Natural. And then the Natural that we actually sell now has a little bit of dosage in it. It has a 0.5% dosage in it, because with no dosage in it, it's almost not drinkable. It's just too tart, too much high acid. It's not very pleasant to drink. That's what my dad liked. But
Well, you've done something right, because if I'm not mistaken, that was I know that was chosen as one of the best white wines of 2021.
yes, it was
here in the area.
Yes, it was.
Just
yes.
recently
Yes, it was.
was chosen for that. We have some Brut right here. Then,
Yes, we do.
Of what you make.
Yes.
Oh gosh, I think we should pour some.
Okay.
Oh, I would have done it.
Huh? Yeah.
You have some experience at this?
Huh? Yeah, I have just a little bit of experience with that.
Tell me about the riddling rack that your dad invented. Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting story, because I asked my dad one time, on the hindsight, on the riddling racks are wonderful, but what made you decide to invent something
It's like an automatic.
an automatic riddling rack? And he said, "Well, I'm lazy. I don't want to have to turn those bottles every day." And we used to have to you used to take the bottles after they were bottled, and you put them down in the cellar, and they put what they called tirage, which was bottles just laying down, and they'd lay there for 2 or 3 years just to age, and then they Mother Nature would make their magic, and then they turn the yeast and the sugar into carbon dioxide, but there was all this yuck left. Well, you got to shake that down to the very tip of the cork, and then freeze it, and then in an ice plug, and it's clear, the bottle's clear on the bottom, but the cork has all this sediment in it. Well, you've got to freeze that, and then you got to pop it out, and that's how you just take the sediment out of the bottle.
And it's in the neck because the bottle's
but the
pointing
bottle's
down.
like this. So you put the bottles in an A-frame in those days, and there was I think it was 120 bottles on each A-frame on each side, and you had to riddle them, so you had to pick them up and shake them and bounce them against the wood.
And turn them as well.
And turn them about a quarter of a turn. Well, that's a lot of work. And now a good riddler, I'm talking about a man that really got some pretty good sized arms on him. He could do about 80,000 bottles a day. And that's all day long.
Now, you told me that last time we did the radio.
Yeah, and I
interview,
wasn't sure if that number was correct, and I looked it up, and I am correct.
And you know what I did? I did the math. I'm thinking, how much do you need to do to get up to 80,000 in a day?
Okay.
And if you think about it, you're doing 2 at a time.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of a couple of seconds.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
And if you could do that and continue to do it
Yeah.
for 7-8 hours, you can reach that number.
Yeah, you can. And it's a lot of work. Anyway, Dad told me that he was lazy and he wanted to make something that could do that automatically. So he made it's really kind of simple what he did. He took the A-frames and he flattened them out.
Yeah.
Now the bottles are at an angle. They're still at an angle. Instead of being an angle this way, they're here, but they're still at an angle. And then he vibrated them. He had them mounted on metal stilts, and then had these air vibrators on each side. And then later on, they turned them to electric. But they would vibrate the whole, shake the whole damn building. You get 300 of these things going off at one time, the whole buildings would rattle down there.
Wow.
But anyway, it would vibrate, and then he had underneath the riddling rack, the first layer was another layer of the same thing that was hooked to a hydraulic cylinder that moved, and every time it moved, the bottle would flop.
Oh.
So when it would be riddling this way, and then when you move the platform, the bottle would flop the other way, and then it would riddle. And when it would flop, it would turn a little bit.
Yeah.
So automatically would do it, and he did it.
Jeez.
So it took, almost 6 to 8 weeks. He could do it about 3 or 4 weeks, because he could do it when all day and all night long when people were not not working.
Yeah.
And, the riddling rack would work when nobody else was.
A few men lost their job, but they were probably happy to lose that.
Yes,
because they needed to go home and work on their
nobody
carpal,
was ever not. Nobody ever
carpal tunnels.
really wanted to go back to go riddling again.
And you did some of that too, didn't you?
Yeah, I did a lot of it.
Yeah.
Every time you get in trouble, Dad would say, "You're riddling." Yeah,
You weren't grounded. You
get something. You get
riddling.
trouble at school or something. Dad say, "You're on the riddling machines."
Wow, that'll keep you straight and narrow, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Like as you intimated, you were making tens of thousands of bottles at that time already.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
When he took over, how many were you making back in the 50s? Was it like
When I took over,
when your dad took over?
When Dad bought Korbel, they were doing about 5,000 cases a year, and that's what they had in inventory, and most of it wasn't saleable. So
Right.
it wasn't. Yeah,
Because the family didn't really care.
Some of
that
it
much.
didn't ferment right, so it didn't do too well. But so I think the 4,000, 5,000 cases the first couple of years Dad owned the company is what we were doing.
And then when you took over in '82, what were you up to at that point?
About 150,000 cases.
And in 2021, you reached.
1,670,000.
So you certainly.
It's grown a little bit.
Yeah. And you've since that time, as we mentioned earlier, you increased the amount of different varietals that you're offering.
Yeah. Yes. Well, even under Dad, we did the Brut Extra Dry Natural Rouge, which is in those days sparkling Burgundy, a red champagne. We did a rosé. It was a pink champagne or rosé.
Mm-hmm.
In the '60s, we called it pink champagne. Now you can't. Now it's rosé or blush. Nobody uses the word pink anymore. But but since then we've added the Blanc de Noir. We've added, which is a vintage Blanc de Noir. We have a vintage and a non-vintage. We have an organic. We have a Moscato, which is very sweet.
Yeah.
We have a sweet rosé. We've got 11 to depending. Some are only sold in the wine shop. So if you add the ones that are only sold in the wine shop, we have 13, 14 different varieties.
Altogether, though, how many do you have now?
17.
17.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still making the brandy.
Yes. Yes, 3 different types of brandy. We make the VSOP, which is a very rare brandy, and then we also make the regular classic brandy, and we make a more of a sweeter, spicier called spice brandy. We have that one too, which we now call XS.
And you have different ages too. You age it several different ages.
Yes,
like
we
10,
have a 12,
20,
14, and 18-year-old brandy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And that's very popular, I'd imagine.
Yeah, they're kind of unique. You start aging brandy that long, there's not a hell of a lot in the barrel left because it evaporates. But it's expensive to make, but it's very, very different tasting.
It's a little bit more affordable though than a lot of the brandies out there.
Yes.
It's what you're hanging your hat on these days, I guess,
Yes.
because a lot of your wines are very
affordable
approachable
luxury
for champagne and for brandy. Affordable luxury. That's good. That could go in the bottle.
that is one of our tagline: affordable luxury.
What would you say is the percentage of tourists that come every year and from around the world? I mean, driving through your parking lot is like going through like Disneyland, where you see license plates from all over the country.
Yeah, you do. I would say it's amazing. It's probably close to 50% or locals.
Mm-hmm.
But I got to qualify that local. 50% are local people that are coming back for their 10th, 11th, 12th time.
Sure.
But they brought one of their relatives from Germany or France or New York or Chicago. There's an awful lot of repeat people that come through Korbel, and why you take the tour of Korbel 15 times, I don't know, but there's a lot of people that come back that bring their relatives. It's a very nice place to be. It's very comfortable here. It's a nice atmosphere, and it's a very lovely tour, a very lovely history we have here.
Sure. And they're probably stopping by Armstrong Woods
Yes.
on the way here to say, this is how the redwoods would look out there
Yes.
when we go to Korbel. You can see.
Yeah, that's right.
But
That's
yeah,
right.
it's a perfect place to bring out-of-town visitors.
It is. It really is. And it's kind of a destination place, especially now with our deli that we have that that people can stop by and have. I'm surprised at the number of people that come out here that are just coming out to the deli.
It's nice sitting out there on the deck.
It is.
You know,
It is. And people do come out here just to have lunch.
My wife and I enjoyed drinking the rouge out on that deck.
Yeah, the
We'd
rouge is-
never seen a sparkling that dark before.
No.
I mean, that red is just a beautiful red color.
It is interesting. It's a very interesting product. People that drink the rouge love the rouge.
Mm-hmm.
It is our best seller in the wine shop.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And certainly around Christmas, I would imagine.
It is. Thanksgiving, Christmas, the rouge does very well. And again, it's one of the ones that you can't buy at the local grocery store. So that's why it's
right.
I think that's a lot of people come to Korbel. They kind of want to try to find something different.
Mhm.
So I mean, you can pretty much, if you can't find it in a local store, there's something wrong with your local store.
Right.
Because I mean, there's that much distribution of it out there.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, speaking of those from France and other places around the world, how did you feel when the French came over here to Northern California and the Spanish and started their own sparkling and champagne houses? And interestingly enough, though, by that time, they couldn't call it champagne. They do call it Brut, California Brut.
Yeah.
But you are grandfathered in, so
Yeah.
you can still call it champagne.
Yeah, we can't. We're grandfathered in. But the first part of that question, when they first started coming over here, one, we were felt a little nervous, a little threatened at the quote the big champagne houses, because some of those houses. I mean, Moet Chandon is a monstrous company.
Sure.
I mean, Korbel is a drop in a bucket compared to the size of Moet Chandon. I mean, it's huge.
Mm-hmm.
For that powerful of a company to come over here, but after they started up, and there's plenty of room. There's plenty of room for us.
Yeah.
And I don't. They certainly did not steal the wine industry or the champagne industry. They actually probably helped it. They probably brought some legitimacy to the whole industry here, the
Right.
sparkling industry. I mean, if the French can come over here and make their champagne here, so can we.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing it for 150 years, longer than they have. But the couple things, they could have called their product champagne when they built their plants here. They chose not to because their parent company wouldn't allow them to.
Okay.
But from a law point of view, they could have called it champagne.
Because
In 1996, was it 96 or 2006? One of those years. I can ask Margie for sure. Because of all the stuff, the arguments and stuff that was going on, we got all the wineries, all the countries together and decided who can call it sparkling wine, who can call it champagne, and everybody agreed, and we all signed the agreement. 96 or 2006, one of those two.
I think it was in the 90s.
We call it champagne, but we call it California champagne.
Mm-hmm.
We don't call it Korbel champagne. It's
Right.
Korbel California champagne, or it's Korbel Russian River Valley champagne, or it's New York champagne.
I think you have a Sonoma champagne too, don't you?
Yeah, you can have a Sonoma champagne, Napa champagne. You can have, as long as it's the place of origin is and it's supposed to be the same type and size, or at least as readable as the word champagne.
But it makes complete sense because Champagne is a location, it's a region.
It is a
and
region.
You're not making wine here in that region, you're making it here
Yeah.
in Sonoma County.
Right.
So, and same with
But
Chablis
it's not only a region, but it's also a method because it is method champenoise.
right. Why so many wineries in the region didn't make it through Prohibition, and you, Korbel, more or less did, and then your father took it on, and but certainly over the that period of time and all the time that you've been here, you've had some struggles and challenges, but you
Yeah.
made it through.
Yeah, there's always challenges. I think there's challenges in any business. I kind of think of my dad sometimes when every time we get these heavy downpour rains and stuff and floods and fires and all the crazy stuff that happens in today's environment. I think of my dad and buying Korbel in 1954, and probably the most damaging flood we ever had was 1955. The highest water mark we ever had was 1986. It was 48.8 feet, but 1955 it was 47.7. So it was not that much lower than the record. The record being in 86, but the damage that the 1955 flood did to the Russian River and the houses and back in those times in 53, 54, there was a lot of properties and barns and houses and stuff that were really close to the river.
Oh, yeah.
That were 40, 50 feet underwater that went down the river.
Oh.
They never survived it. By the time 86 comes around, even though it was higher, most of all the damage was, low-lying damage was done. There's still damage done because Guerneville goes under, under a 6 inches, whatever, but not the devastation that it had in 1955. I mean, I can remember in 55 as a little kid going down in front of the winery, watching houses going down the river.
Wow, what a sight.
People's homes going down the river, just getting destroyed. I mean, it was a total, and I can imagine my dad sitting there in those days going, what the hell did I buy?
How many times is this going to be happening in the future? Well, thankfully it wasn't that often then.
No, it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen once in a while. And, most of the time now we're prepared for it. Now in 1955, the cellars flooded, the whole building, the first floor, the whole building, all the tanks in the bottom of the winery were floating around. I mean, those huge 23,000 gallon tanks down there were floating around. I mean, it was, and there was a lot of damage to the winery in 1955. But now we have drains, stuff that take that out. If the water starts coming in and it won't go out because the river's higher, we have ways of moving it around the backside. So
great. Boy, when you walk around here, you see so much of the history. Like the post office you mentioned. You have a lot of the old signs are still here hanging up, and it's such a treat to see the past as you're walking
the
by.
post office, which you walked by or drove by when you came up, and across from that was a blacksmith shop. They didn't own a tractor when we bought the place. They had 3 horses, 3 plow horses that they were still plowing most of the vineyards by hand. Dad bought the first tractor ever for Korbel. That never had a tractor here. It was all done with horse. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. We still had the horses when we bought the place. Big plow horses. The building behind us here, which this was what we call the rec room now, that was the dining room. The whole front half of that was the area where everybody sat and had their breakfast, lunch, and dinners. And then the back side of that was a major kitchen. All wood burning stove and everything was the kitchen. So they did because almost all the employees of Korbel back in those days all lived here.
I was going to ask that question.
The bunkhouse, which is now one of our accounting buildings, it was the 14 bed bunkhouse, and there was 6 or 7 other houses. Some of them we've turned into guest houses, but most of those were employees' houses that lived here.
Because there wasn't a whole lot of nearby towns at that time.
No,
in the 50s.
No, there wasn't.
Sebastopol wasn't too far. Guerneville wasn't too far away. But
not too bad.
But at that time,
Hilton, which is just down the road. Do you know where Hilton is? It's kind of in between here and Hacienda. It's a little turnoff.
Okay.
There, it's right past the pub, the bar.
I know where the pub is.
Okay, right next to the pub is a little place called Hilton. Well, that was a grocery store.
Oh, okay.
That was a little town grocery store, and you could pick up most of your milk and your foods there. Now it kind of got pretty much destroyed in 1955.
Oh, yeah.
It came back a little bit.
That's pretty close to the river.
Yeah, real close to the river and a little lower than the pub, so it got a little more damage. but it came back, but it didn't ever come back strong enough to survive, and it was a casualty of one of the floods.
How many acres did the property have when your father took it over?
When
Do you
he
recall?
bought it, the Korbels had 640 acres, one section.
Oh, okay.
One section.
And what are you up to now?
We've got almost 4 sections, so 2,400 acres.
24. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we do have some vineyards that are not here at Korbel. We have a couple of 100 acres in Guerneville. We have a couple of 100 acres in Santa Rosa, in the Plains. My home that's near Santa Rosa, that's 25 acres on it, and then we have 700 acres near Sacramento and Clarksburg.
Uh-huh.
We
All
have-
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, are you doing that because you needed more land, or because you like what the terroir and the region brings to the flavor of the wines?
We need to do vineyards.
Okay.
We need
Yeah,
the
just
vineyards.
needed the space.
Yeah, we need more vineyards, and even now, I mean, we still buy probably, which is we have a wonderful grower relationship with our growers. Some of them been with us for 50 years. We probably buy 80% of our grapes. We don't. We,
Yeah.
1,600,000 champagne is a lot of grapes.
It is.
Yeah, and brandy, brandy's roughly 400,000 cases, depending on what year. It takes 4 gallons of wine to make 1 gallon of brandy. So
That's a lot of. Yeah,
that's a lot more grapes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow. How would you sum up the impact that and what Korbel Champagne Cellars has brought to Sonoma County and contributed to the area?
Oh, I think we've brought a lot to the county. I think the county has brought a lot to Korbel also. The history that the county had gone to develop, like the profile of the Russian River and everything, is we've benefited from that. I think us growing our production here and our product here, we've done a lot for the county. We do a lot with charity. We do a lot with the schools and that kind of stuff too. So we give back a lot to the community. The community also gives us a lot
Sure.
too.
And you've worked with the Sonoma County Vintners and been on their board and president.
I was president of the board for a couple of terms. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You were the vintner honoree this year for their.
Yeah, I was vintner honoree this
the
year,
auction.
which is quite an honor. It's very, very nice. Very
Yes.
nice.
So you're close to 2 million cases. Do you think that's going to be reasonable, possible, in the next year or 2 or 3?
If we can get the grapes, if we can get the glass, we could probably do 2 million cases within 3 years. Yeah, I think production-wise, we can do it. We probably have to have a little bit more aging space.
Mm.
If we can't build it here, we can rent it. We can rent space in Santa Rosa at some of the warehouses. We are already renting some space from some of the spaces in Santa Rosa, some of the major places in Santa Rosa that have space to rent. That's getting a little tough too, to find places that have.
Yes.
Like, you just don't stick 200,000 cases somewhere. It takes up a lot of space. but yeah, we could go to 2 million cases in 3 years.
Nice to
Yeah.
see. I imagine if
But
somehow,
everything's got to be right to do that. I
of
mean,
course, yeah.
grapes and product. We talked about the floods. The fires came real close.
Oh, I bet. Yes.
Right up atop the hill there.
Mhm. That's always a concern.
Yeah, that's a concern. And it's wonderful to live here in the trees, and the scenery we got here is absolutely spectacular.
Sure.
It's also a fire hazard.
Mhm.
We live right in the middle of a major fire hazard here with all these beautiful redwood trees and stuff around. And
Well, we'll hope that the
Yeah, I
luck will
hope that's-
continue.
hope that's the end of that for a while. But we do go through trials and tribulations here, just like every business does. But we've been successful.
Well, I imagine if the Korbel brothers could look back and or look and see what you're doing now, they'd be incredibly impressed with what
I think
you've
that I
done.
think they'd be smiling. I think they'd be smiling. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure Francis is glad the tower is still there too.
Yeah. Yeah. We
Well-
had to work on the tower too. It cracked during the 1906 earthquake.
Oh.
The tower cracked. That's why there's those 3 metal bands on it.
Okay.
They put
yeah.
those metal bands on it to try to hold the tower from falling down. So
I thought you were just trying to make it look like a barrel.
no, no, that's I never thought about that way, but probably a lot of people think so. No, those bands are on there to
They're there for a purpose.
yeah,
Yeah,
to keep it together.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on an incredible
you.
success that you've had here at Korbel Champagne Cellars, you and your father, and may it continue as long as you want it to.
Thank you.
I should cheers you with that.
Thank you. Cheers.